All right, well, welcome everybody to our next session. This session, as you can see by the placard, is going to be focused on the first pope that we're going to be looking at in any great detail, Pope Gregory the First, also known as Gregory the Great, who was also or has been named by historians as God's consul. And Gregory will make the foundation or set the foundation of the medieval papacy. He's not the most powerful pope that we will look at in this series, but he is the guy who kind of sets the stage and makes the scene for the rest of them. And his influence is so great that he's considered by the Catholic Church to be one of the great doctors of the Church, in the same status as Augustine, Ambrose, or Jerome. So he's quite significant as far as Western Church history goes. In terms of popes, we're not going to look at a ton of popes in great detail. We're going to look at Gregory. We're going to look at Innocent III. We're going to look at Gregory VII. We might look at a few others like Urban II, although we're going to be looking at them not so much in terms of their life, but in terms of the context of their reign and what they did. So Gregory, we're going to go into a bit of detail with. I don't anticipate doing that for every pope because there are 200. Well, currently this is what, the 250th or something, 251st, I can't remember. But in any case, there's a lot of them. So, and frankly, a lot of these guys don't live more than 5 years. So we're going to look at a few of these guys, like I said, and we're going to start with Pope Gregory the First. And so we're going to dial it back a bit from the iconoclastic era here. We're going to be moving back in time a little bit. And we're going to be looking at Gregory and his reign. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint set up here. So I want to talk first, before we go into Gregory, I want to talk a bit about the papacy itself. So it's important that we have a good understanding of the office of the papacy and who the Pope is. The Pope, I hope you all know, or you may all know, or you may not know. That's why we have this class. Maybe you don't know this. The Pope is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. He is the spiritual head of the Church. He is the supreme lawgiver in the Church, and he is the supreme interpreter of Scripture. His authority currently is that he has the authority to declare what the true teachings of the Church are and are not. And my understanding is that he does not have to refer to a church council to do this. He has the ability to speak as basically as a kind of an absolute ruler. When the Pope speaks ex cathedra, that is from the chair or from his throne, which you see him sitting in, he speaks infallibly. So that is a doctrine that was brought about, I believe, in the mid-1800s. It's kind of been a doctrine of the Catholic Church throughout its history as time goes on, that the Pope has a certain amount of infallibility, but that's not always been agreed upon by everybody. But I believe it was at the First Vatican Council in the mid-1800s that the principle of papal infallibility was actually enshrined in canon law. In addition to being the spiritual leader of the Church, the Pope is also the secular head of state of Vatican City, or of the state of Vatican City, which he rules as an absolute monarch. So the way you have to look at this is that Vatican City is an independent country. It's an independent city-state, which is ruled by the Pope. The Pope is elected by the cardinals, but once he's elected, he has absolute power in Vatican City. So he is one of the few absolute monarchs left on earth. In addition to ruling Vatican City and being the spiritual leader for billions of Catholics around the world, he is also the Bishop of Rome, and he has diocesan duties, just like any other bishop, in the Diocese of Rome. Now, he is generally aided in this by deacons and by other bishops who take on these day-to-day things for him, but he still has these important duties. The Pope's cathedral, by the way, is the Cathedral of St. John Lateran. So if you're looking for the Pope's seat as Bishop of Rome, it is in St. John Lateran. It is not St. Peter's Basilica. Okay, so just bear that in mind. If you're ever in Rome, you want to see the Pope's cathedral as Bishop of Rome, go to St. John Lateran. It is probably the most ancient of churches. and the palace attached to it is the Lateran Palace, which is actually where the residence of the popes was for many centuries. That later changed to the Quirinial Palace. Quirinal Palace. I have a hard time saying that name, which is now the residence of the President of Italy, and it was at one point the residence of the kings of Italy. And the Pope currently resides in a place called the Apostolic Palace in Vatican City, which is easily viewed from St. Peter's Square. So the Pope is elected in a conclave, which is a closed gathering of cardinals. Cardinals are the highest ranking churchmen in the Catholic Church, and they are appointed by the Pope as he sees fit. So there are 3 levels of cardinal. All 3 of these, so these are basically, they're more related to work, not necessarily to rank. They all have an equal vote in the conclave. So these would be 3 ranks are cardinal bishop, which is a limited rank. It's limited to 6 cardinals who have oversight of one of 6 historic churches in suburban Rome. Then there's the cardinal priest. These are bishops who work in dioceses outside of Rome. So cardinal priest would include, I believe, for example, the Archbishop of Quebec, I believe, is a cardinal. So he would be cardinal priest. That would be his level. Or if you were an archbishop of, let's say, Boston or New York, and you were appointed a cardinal, you would probably be appointed a cardinal priest unless you were summoned to Rome and appointed a cardinal bishop. So that's kind of how that works. Cardinal deacons are bishops who don't work in the ministry, so to speak, in a church or in a diocese. They don't head a diocese. They work in the Roman Curia, which is the church administration in the Vatican City itself. So these are your officials, people who run various offices of the church, oversee various administrative functions. Those are cardinal deacons. So by far the largest group are the cardinal priests, and the rule is each cardinal who is under 80 years of age may vote in a papal conclave to elect a new pope. So to vote in the conclave, you have to be under 80 years old. This is, I guess, an attempt to prevent somebody who's too old from being elected pope. They have had very elderly popes in there, and I guess this was an attempt to prevent that. That's a relatively new rule, by the way. I believe that was brought in by Pope John Paul II. But in any case, that's how that works. Originally, popes were elected by popular acclamation of the people of Rome because they are the people of the Diocese of Rome, and so they elected their own bishop. But by the Middle Ages, the process had become much more formalized and had been shrunk down and made a little bit more elite in the persons of the College of Cardinals. The elections of popes were not always recognized by other authorities, and there were times when other popes were elected by other factions in the church, which stirred up a lot of conflict. But this happened during what is known as the Babylonian captivity of the church in the 14th century. There was a dispute about papal elections, and what happened was a group of bishops in Rome elected one pope, and another group of bishops said, well, we don't like that pope, we're going to elect another pope. And so they elected their own pope. And the pope in Rome was recognized by some kings and principalities, and the pope in the city of Avignon, which is where the anti-pope was based, was recognized by other kings. And there was a battle between the popes to see who was the real pope. And this all ended, I believe, with the Council of Constance. I believe it was Council of Constance, which settled on who deposed both popes and put in a new pope, which is Pope Martin, I believe. But in any case, it's an interesting point in papal history. We'll look at that a little bit more, the Avignon residence of the popes. Avignon is in France. It's a city in France. And the old medieval papal palace still survives there, and the popes lived there for about 80 years under the quote-unquote protection of the King of France, more like his prisoner. So in theory, any Catholic male can be elected pope. In practice, it is always a member of the College of Cardinals. The cardinals who are thought to be really good candidates for the office are often given the title of Papabile by the people or by the press. And Papabile is like Papa-able, or he's popable. He's the potential to be a pope. He is popable, It's kind of like that Jeopardy category, potable potables or potable potables or something like that. It's a tongue twister. So papabile is a nice Italian word you can memorize. Well, that guy is really papabile. You can say that to your friends or to your family. I don't know if that would be a joke or an insult. Anyway, it's up to you. But in any case, so if you see a guy he's thought of being papabile, then he'd be a good candidate to be the Pope. And in fact, there have been, I believe, Cardinal Ouellet from Quebec was the papabile in the last papal election and the papal election before that, but he was not elected. But can you imagine a Canadian cardinal as Pope? I don't know what the federal Liberal government would do with that. They'd probably jump for joy and then realize that he's actually a really conservative guy and he's not going to support them at all. And he's not going to be like these typical Canadian celebrities that you see abroad who just constantly step in it. But in any case, that's the way it goes. So when a pope dies or resigns, all cardinals under the age of 80 are summoned to Rome, where they are shut into the Sistine Chapel, that beautiful chapel that we all know with the Michelangelo's painting of the creation of man, the creation of Adam. It's a beautiful place, by the way, if you ever visit there. I was there. It is packed full of people, though. It is really, really packed. If you can get like a behind the scenes tour when it is not full of people, definitely recommend it. It might be worth the money if you're a big art lover, because then you can actually like potentially lie on the chapel floor and actually see the painting without craning your neck. So multiple rounds of voting are held until a candidate receives 2/3 of the vote cast. So he needs a supermajority, 67% of the votes cast, to be elected pope. After each round of voting where a pope is not chosen, the ballots are burned in a special furnace which emits a black smoke. And this is a signal to the people waiting in the square outside that a pope has not been elected. But when a successful vote occurs, the ballots are burned in a furnace and they add like a substance or powder that produces white smoke. And then that tells everybody that a pope has been elected. And the new pope then chooses their name and is presented to the public in St. Peter's Square. Now, popes don't reign under their own names, just like any other monarch. They have the ability to choose a regnal name. So we all know that, for example, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger was not Pope Joseph I. He was Pope Benedict XVI. Oftentimes, regnal names are taken to try and signal to people what kind of a pope the person wants to be, who they're going to emulate. So, for example, Benedict XVI was a fan of Benedict XV, and so he wanted to signal that he was going to have a papacy, or he wanted his papacy to be like that kind of. Pope Francis is a Jesuit, and he is he wanted his papacy to mirror sort of the life and the work and of Francis of Assisi, Saint Francis of Assisi, who was famously led an ascetic life and worked to help the poor. And the Franciscan monks were notorious for their vows of poverty and chastity and all that kind of stuff. So that's sort of the thing that he wants to emulate, is this humility, this humble service, the fact that he's not in this for any sort of gain. It's all about bringing the church back to the people, I think, is how we would look at that. And if you look at his recent pronouncements on issues like homosexuality and other issues, he has kind of taken church into a little bit more of a gray area, more of a liberal wing. And I think that has caused some consternation in the Roman Church. Certainly, I think that the next pope is probably going to be a lot more conservative, frankly, than current Pope Francis. But in any case, that's how papal elections are held. Now, are they shut into the Sistine Chapel, or are they locked in? And the answer is they are locked in, and the door is sealed. There are beds laid out in certain parts of the chapel so that they can sleep there. And in the past, and I don't know if this is the current case now, but in the past, what has been done when papal elections, because papal elections in the past would drag on and on and on for weeks, even months at a time, is it was common for when papal elections just drug on, for the food to be reduced. So as the cardinals voted and didn't elect anybody, their the amount of food that they were given would be reduced to kind of press the point that they needed to get this done. So papal power has changed over history. It's not always been the office that we see today. It started out as a spiritual office, as the Bishop of Rome. We know that traditionally the Catholic Church views Peter, the Apostle, as the first bishop of Rome. And as an apostle, his office is spiritual. And so it started off as a spiritual office, really with an oversight role. Or rather, then it evolved into having an oversight role, not only over priests and bishops of the Roman area, like a typical diocesan bishop would have. A diocese, by the way, is the area overseen by a bishop. But he began to take a supervisory role over the whole of the Western Church. Now, you'll remember back when we were talking about the early church, how when the church structure became more formalized as it began to develop, there were certain cities whose bishops took on the role as sort of, excuse me, an appellate court. So these would be bishops like Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. And those bishops were given the higher sounding title patriarch to mark that status. And Rome, being the only one of those churches, or only one of those cities in the western part of the Roman Empire, became sort of inordinately more influential in the West than those other bishops would have been in the East, because there's no competition in the West. So that's sort of how that rolls. So he kind of takes on the supervisory role. He's not supreme in any way. He's not above a council. His word isn't law, but he has a supervisory role, and his word carries a lot of weight. Let's put it that way. The Pope, after being sort of the supervisory role, it evolves into being more of a headship and a primacy of the church overall. So the Pope is not just claiming to be anymore as primus inter pares, that is, first among equals. He starts to claim that he is indeed superior to all other bishops and churchmen in the church. The papacy obtains significant land holdings in central Italy, which evolved to become what is called the Papal States. And the Pope rules the Papal States as a secular monarch. And the Papal States survived until quite recently, actually, until the creation of the Kingdom of Italy in the 1860s. That's how long the Papal States stuck around. And there's only a few vestiges of it remaining, which are Vatican City and an enclave called Castel Gandolfo, which is the former papal summer residence. Rome in summer gets very, very hot. If you've ever traveled in Italy, you know that it's tempting to go in summer because the weather is going to be sunny. It's not tempting to go in summer because it's going to be beastly hot. Now, some of you I know are thinking, oh man, beastly hot. I love beastly hot. I love sitting on the beach in the full sun with no shade. I'm one of these weird people who just really loves the sun, beastly hot, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, bring on the heat. I am not one of those people. I hate when it's too hot. Just hate it. So I really liked going to Rome in the shoulder season. We went in spring or fall, when the weather is cooler, and you can actually walk around without having to worry about getting sunburned or dying of thirst, although there are lots of public fountains in Rome that run continuously, so that wouldn't be a problem. But in any case, the Pope has a summer residence in a place called Castel Gandolfo. It's a little enclave where he has a residence, and they generally went there for summer. It's outside of Rome in the hills, outside of Rome where it's a little bit cooler. The current Pope has actually not used it as a summer residence. He's opened it to the public as a museum. We'll see if future popes keep it that way. I kind of have my doubts. But in any case, so at its height, at its most powerful, the papacy not only claims spiritual and pastoral oversight of the church, but also the right to set up and remove kings and emperors, because he is God's representative on earth. He is the head of the church on earth. He is the vicar of Christ. So a vicar is kind of somebody who is in place of somebody. It's like a vice. So if you talk about the president and the vice president, when the president's not in charge, the vice president is. When Christ isn't on earth, the Pope is. He's the vicar, or the vice Christ, I guess you could say. This is why in the Reformation, the reformer is always referred to him as the Antichrist, because anti also has that meaning as putting yourself in the place of something else. It's not an opposite to Christ. Anti does not necessarily mean opposing, but in the place of. So an antichrist is something in the place of Christ, not opposing Christ, although they would often oppose Christ and do often oppose Christ, but something in the place of Christ, which we know is wrong. So that's how that word works. So next time you're reading the part about the Antichrist in the Bible, now you know this is not a person opposing Christ, although they will oppose Christ. Antichrist means in the place of Christ. So anything or any person that is in the place of Christ in your life is an Antichrist. How about that? Are you prideful? Do you have someone who you love more than Jesus? They are an Antichrist for you. Okay? I didn't want to blow your mind there. Maybe I didn't, but think about it a little bit. You might disagree with me, and that's fine. So the last point there, the Pope claiming the right to set up and remove kings and emperors sets the stage kind of for the investiture controversy, which we'll talk about a little bit later, between the emperor and the Pope as to who has the authority to not only set up who has the authority to install popes and emperors, but who has the authority to appoint bishops and abbots and all of those other kinds of churchmen. So the Pope has a few titles, and these are them. He is the Bishop of Rome. He is the Vicar of Christ. So we talk about vicar. So he's here in the place of Christ. So if you think about vicar, in English churches, in particular in England, you might hear the priest or the pastor referred to as vicar. That's an old title. It's just somebody standing in. He's representing Christ to you. That's what the vicar is. It's kind of, some people see it as kind of a blasphemous title. I'm not sure, but it's kind of iffy. Then you have successor to the Prince of Apostles, the Prince of Apostles being Peter, of course. Then Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church, Primate of Italy, so that means he is the highest ranking churchman in all of Italy. He is the Archbishop and Metropolitan of the Roman province, the Sovereign of the State of Vatican City, Servant of the servants of God, Patriarch of the West. That's not used anymore. They dropped Patriarch of the West relatively recently. Actually, I believe it was John Paul II who dropped it, but they no longer use it. And Protestant reformers would probably add Antichrist in here as well. The Catholic Church didn't. So, we'll talk a bit about the Protestant. When we get to the Reformation, we'll talk a bit about how the Protestant reformers viewed the Pope and why he was such a good foil as being their Antichrist. So it's a lofty office from lowly men. I'm going to look at the structure of the church a bit here. So basically, the bishops of the early church, if you remember, were men of great courage. They endured persecution for the sake of the church, and they risked a lot. I mean, if you remember Athanasius in Alexandria being exiled like five or more times over disputes with the current emperor, even disputes within the church itself. We're not even talking about death. The early church faced death and destruction, the elders of the church even more so. They did a lot of practical work in running the church. The evolution of the papacy was a matter of societal influence and skillful political maneuvering. And the church's structure in the Middle Ages has adopted a more formalized and hierarchical look. So this kind of mirrored secular society at the time, because medieval society was pyramidal and feudal. So if you look at the pyramid there, this is a very basic pyramid that shows the structure of medieval society. So you have, at the top, you have your rulers, your kings and your nobles, and then under them are the prayers, not prayers, but prayers, people who pray. Those would be your priests, your bishops, your monks, etc. And then under them, you have your workers. So that's everybody else, the peasants, merchants, all that kind of thing. We're in that group. So that's what medieval society is. Now you can get more detail out of this, certainly. This is what you would see in a standard, I think, in a standard introduction to medieval society. This is what you would see in terms of what medieval society looked like. So what does feudal mean? Feudal is a type of societal structure that's based on obligations and duties. So basically, in a feudal society, you have your kings, your lords, and your peasants. So the king provides, so the lords provide men and money to the king in wartime, and the king provides them with protection. So there's a two-way street there. The nobles provide the peasants with protection and stability and land, and in return, the peasants provide him with labor and military service, or a portion of their crops. So peasants would spend a certain percentage of their time working the lord's land, and they would spend a certain percentage of time working their own land. Or they would give a chunk of their crops every year to the noble as rent payment. So that's kind of feudalism. Feudalism, in its most egregious form, I think, went to the level of serfdom, which is where peasants were tied to the land. They actually couldn't leave the plot of land they were on. It's kind of a form of free slavery, I would say. Serfs were not allowed to marry without permission. They couldn't leave their land without permission. That is, they couldn't move. They couldn't move from one spot to another spot. So you couldn't move from, let's say, your farm outside Grunthal to a farm outside Winnipeg without your lord's permission. And if your lord sold the land, well, you went with it. And so you were now the serf of somebody else. So serfdom was kind of a form of slavery that was common in the Middle Ages. It died out in England. It died out pretty quickly. In France, it died out pretty quickly. The longest, the country that had serfdom the longest is Russia, which had serfdom until the 1860s, I believe. So very backwards in Russia. Russia is an interesting study from a historical standpoint, because it's a country, like many countries, it's a country of what ifs. What if better progress had been made earlier? Russia could easily be like the United States. But yeah, it's kind of a question on what ifs. So this is the medieval church structure here. So it mirrors the medieval society structure that you can see. So at the top, you have your pope, who's the head of everything. Then is the curia, which are the papal officials, or the papal court, if you will, to use a slightly grander term. And under them are the bishops, and then you have your priests and your parishioners, so everybody else. And then on the side, you have monastic orders. Monastic orders, depending on the order, were either under the jurisdiction of the local bishop, where the monastery was located, or they were under the jurisdiction of the pope. So they only answer to the pope. So those would be your more powerful kind of things. I think your Augustinians and Benedictines. These are guys, or your Knights Templar, for example, or your Knights Hospitaller, for example. They didn't answer to bishops. They answered to the pope himself. So they had a lot more freedom, and they had a lot higher status. Just want to drop back to the medieval society here. So you see these three levels. Now, to give you an idea of how entrenched this pyramid was in society, in a lot of countries in Europe and continental Europe, these three levels formed parliament. So in France, for example, there were three estates in the French Parliament. There were three houses, three estates. So in Canada, we have two houses. We have the House of Commons and the Senate. In the United States, they have the House of Representatives and the Senate. In France, they had three houses. They had the first estate, which was the church. So that would be filled with bishops and priests and abbots and churchmen. Then you had the second estate, which was the nobles. So the nobility would form that estate. And then you had the third estate, which was everybody else. So the peasants and the commoners, or the commoners, if you will. And the way the French Parliament worked is that it voted by estate. So the French estate, these are called, the French Parliament, by the way, was called the Estates General. Excuse me. So the first estate would vote, and if they decided to pass something, their whole vote would be so each estate has one vote, essentially. So in each house, they vote to see how they're going to cast their one vote. Generally, the nobles and the church are voting together because they are the societal elites, which means that they will always outvote by 2-1 the third estate, even though the third estate is by far the majority of the population. So this really prevents a lot of reform from coming through. And the Estates General actually doesn't. The Estates General last meets in 1789, I believe, when Louis XVI calls into session and promptly initiates the French Revolution. When the Estates General had not met before that time for over 100 years. So the Estates General in France doesn't meet all that often. It's not really a useful body. It's not like the British Parliament. It doesn't really have any sort of supremacy or place in law in the French society. The French monarchy is very absolutist, and that's what eventually causes the French Revolution. So my point is that this hierarchy of people gets formalized into the formal structures and institutions of society in the Middle Ages, and it becomes something very difficult to work out of. We don't have a class system in North America, and that's basically, I think, because a lot of people, when they came here to leave the class system behind because the class system held them back. The class system is still very much entrenched in the UK, and I think in other parts of Europe, because even though nobility has been abolished in a lot of parts of Europe, noble titles can still be used as a part of your name. So if you're, a Prince of Prussia, for example, part of your name will be Prince of Prussia. And the associations of the noble families with each other and with the elites of society still exist. So the class system still very much exists in Europe, I think, to some extent. Not in North America, although we do have a different class system here. Our class system is not based on birth. It's not based on the historical positioning of our family. Our class system is based on economic wealth and prestige. And so you can fall very quickly in our class system. Whereas in the UK, for example, it was very common. It's quite common to have people with noble titles, Baron, Viscount, Earl, that sort of thing, but they have no money. Whereas here it's much more common for people to have a lot of money but no title. And there, a titled person still has the cachet of being upper class because of their family history and what their title is. Whereas here, if you lose your money, you're going to fall out of that upper echelon of society extremely quickly. So where does the medieval papacy begin? The true medieval papacy begins with Gregory I. There are two Popes Gregory, as I was saying before, that we're going to look at in this series, Pope Gregory I and Gregory VII. But we're going to focus on Gregory I in this session. And Gregory I firmly establishes papal claims to spiritual and secular authority in the West. He fights with Constantinople over which of them is superior, the Pope or the Patriarch. And he moves the church away from the teachings of Augustine while still claiming to be Augustinian. So St. Augustine of Hippo had been the great theologian of the time. And Gregory subtly starts moving the church away from Augustine's theology into the beliefs and the systems that govern the Catholic Church even up to this day. He establishes the church firmly as the only source of organized harmony in a very unstable and unharmonious European world. So he does a lot to bring the prestige and the power of the church up by simply being the most reliable institution that there is. So Gregory is born in 540 into an old, wealthy Roman family of the senatorial class. So basically they're aristocrats and they're very rich. And this is about the same time frame that Rome and much of Italy was being reconquered by the Eastern Empire under Justinian. His family has very close connections in the church hierarchy, and his father, Gordianus, is served as a senator and as a prefect of Rome. So a prefect of Rome is like a mayor on steroids, basically. Not only is he responsible for city administration and for the day-to-day functioning of the government, but he's also responsible for maintaining all the infrastructure in the city, and he's responsible for the social welfare system in Rome, and he's responsible for the city's grain supply and its distribution. The Roman grain supply is extremely important. It's how Romans are fed, it's how they're kept fed. Italy itself cannot supply enough grain in enough quantities to feed the city of Rome. It's never been able to. Rome's grain supply has always been based in Egypt. Egypt is an agricultural powerhouse, it's a breadbasket, and even in ancient times, the Roman population was sustained by Egyptian grain. And it's the prefects of Rome's job to make sure that those grain supplies are maintained. And in fact, if you want to siege Rome and take it down, you would attack its grain supply. Gregory is well connected to the church hierarchy, as I said. In fact, his great-great-grandfather is Pope Felix III. And his family owns many large villas in Rome, has a large villa in Rome, and they have large estates in the Roman countryside and in Sicily. And they're wealthy landowners, they're aristocrats, they have mobility. When war comes to Rome, they're able to kind of flee to their estates in the south and then come back. It doesn't really affect them all that much. His mother's name was Sylvia, just as a side note there, Gordianus and Sylvia. Two names, if you're ever looking for names for your kids, there's two examples right there. I don't know if you want your, yeah. Okay. This is a world. It's a world like a shattered window, as I've titled this slide. So to give you an idea of kind of what the world is facing and what people are dealing with, in 542, the plague of Justinian, which is a form of Black Plague, I believe, ravaged the Byzantine Empire, including Italy. Rome was also attacked several times, first by the Ostrogoths in 546, and then by the Franks in 554. After these invasions, the Byzantines regained control, and then peace finally settled in. You may be wondering where these terms come from. Ostrogoth, where does that come from? Well, use your knowledge of German. For those of you who speak German or who speak Low German, what is the word for east? Ost. So Goth is Goth or a Germanic tribe. So the Ostrogoths are Eastern Goths. They come from the eastern part of Europe, whereas Visigoths come from the west, I believe, and the Franks are a tribe from France, which makes a lot of sense. That's where we got the term France, from the Franks, land of the Franks, France. In fact, Franks and Frankish will be terms used in the Middle East to describe Western Europeans in general. They'll be called Franks because of the large contingent of French soldiers in or during the Crusades. But the Franks will become a very important power in Europe, who we'll look at when we talk about Charlemagne. Basically, so there would, I gotta back up here. Okay, so the Byzantines gain control. They bring peace to the Italian peninsula. Rome had been sacked several times during this period by different groups, and so it was really kind of a shattered city. There was political instability, war, famine, disease, and made this time very uncertain for a lot of people. And it really fed the notion that the return of Christ was imminent and the world would end soon. If there was any time in history where people would sit and say, yeah, Christ is coming soon, it must have been that time, because there's no stability politically. There's constant war, constant famine, constant pestilence and disease. You look at that and you say, yeah, the world's coming to an end. I don't think we've ever experienced anything, at least here in Canada, that we can say, yeah, the world's coming soon. I mean, if anybody had justification for saying it, it was the people at this time. Gregory's family likely fled Rome to their southern estates during these wars, but they would have returned when peace was restored. Gregory was well educated. He was taught grammar, rhetoric, law, literature, science, mathematics, and music. And this was intended to prepare him to become a high ranking government official, which he did when he was appointed prefect of Rome at the age of 33 in 573. So imagine somebody my age, I'm 33, imagine somebody my age being appointed prefect of a major metropolitan center like New York City and suddenly being responsible for absolutely everything in it. That would be incredible and daunting. But it shows the level of competence that he had and how good he was diplomatically and politically. Gregory serves as prefect only for a few years, and then he decided that wielding political power was not really his thing. And he decided that he wanted a more quiet life, a life of reflection and of solitude and of study. And so naturally, when you want that, you become a monk. After his father died, he inherits the family's wealth and their properties, and he transforms their luxurious villa on the Caelian Hill in Rome into a monastery dedicated to St. Andrew's Monastery. He founds several monasteries on his family's estates in southern Italy, which he endows with a lot of the land that he has in southern Italy, but he still retains a certain amount of land in his own personal ownership for some time. But he very enthusiastically embraces monastic asceticism. He eats only raw fruits and vegetables. He spends his night in prayer, and he wears a hair shirt, which is a very uncomfortable shirt that is meant to keep you mindful of your sinful nature and always humble, I guess. That hair shirt is like a symbol of humility. He was a very able and well-respected monk. However, the ascetic lifestyle that he adopted was so strict that it actually had a detrimental effect on his health. And we know, for example, that he had heart issues, and his lifestyle and his diet probably contributed to those being aggravated. So Gregory's superb reputation as a monk, truly dedicated to his calling, could not shield his natural political and diplomatic abilities. And in 579, the Pope, who was a guy unfortunately named Pelagius II, made him papal ambassador to the imperial court in Constantinople. So his diplomatic skills come into great use when he is representing the Pope there. And in fact, he stays in Constantinople for about 5 years. And then the Pope decides to reward him by appointing him the abbot of the monastery that he founded, which is St. Andrew's Monastery. And so he comes back to Rome. Gregory was always more comfortable in the reclusive, reflective life as of the monastery, and he would have been happy to remain where he was. And he would have, had not in 590 a plague sweep through Rome. And the plague killed Pope Pelagius II. Plague pandemics generally lasted centuries. So if you'll remember, so the plague comes to Europe. The one we're familiar with is the Black Death. But the plague has been a pandemic or endemic in Europe for many centuries. Plagues affected the Roman Empire. They affect the Middle Ages. They affect even up into the early modern era when we finally understood disease and germs better. Plague has been a pandemic in Europe for centuries. So when we think about this pandemic, it's really quite mild in comparison. I'm not going to get into a debate here on the merits of lockdowns and of masks and of COVIDism, because it's just drill your brain out of your head and throw it in the garbage if you want to get into that. In any case, so lockdowns, and I want to point out though that during plague pandemics, lockdowns are far more common than they are here, and they were far more severe. In fact, it was common for a plague-infested home to be walled up. So the people inside would have to either survive walled in, they might get food brought to them through a little slit in the wall, but otherwise they would have to survive until the plague left their home. I don't see anybody proposing that here. So it's not as bad as it can be. The plague was accompanied by severe flooding on the Tiber, and years of war and instability had made it seem like God had placed all of Italy under judgment, and that's really what a lot of people felt. So 6 months went by before the church decides to elect Gregory as the new pope, and Gregory doesn't want to be the pope. He wants to be a monk in the monastery, left alone with his reflection and his thoughts. And in fact, he didn't want to be the pope so badly that he fled the city and hid in a forest until he was found and dragged back to Rome and installed as pope. Constantinople confirmed his election, that they recognized him as the pope, and he was consecrated on September 3rd in 590. And he claimed at being elected pope, he said he was so stricken with sorrow he could barely speak. He really didn't want to be the pope. But after his election, as many people do when they're elected to reluctant offices, he puts aside his misgivings and he gets down to work and takes the duties that he's assigned very seriously, and he devotes a great amount of energy and vigor to them. He started by trying to deal with the plague problem, and he does this by leading a procession. 7 processions walked through the streets of Rome for 3 days, during which prayers were said and hymns were sung. And while the effect was not immediate, the plague seemed to subside after this. And there's a legend that says that the Pope led a procession to the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, and in a vision, the archangel appeared above Hadrian's tomb, which is currently the Castel Sant'Angelo. And the vision sheathed its sword and disappeared. So remember, Michael is the leader of the heavenly army, and so he sheathes his sword and he leaves, and that's a symbolic of the plague leaving Rome. The judgment was over. And there's in fact a statue of Saint Michael on top of the Castel Sant'Angelo, of Michael sheathing his sword, and I believe I have some pictures here. So on the left is the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. This basilica, of course, in the Baroque style, it would not have looked at this like this in Gregory's time. But that's nonetheless the basilica itself. And then on the right is the Castel Sant'Angelo, which was turned into a fortress, a papal fortress. And so was surrounded by this magnificent castle wall. But the Hadrian's tomb is that round building in the back, which serves as the keep. And on top, you can just see his wing there. It's a statue of St. Michael. Fantastic place to go. Definitely recommend you go see both of these buildings if you're ever in Rome. Very, very interesting. Gregory is a big believer in missions. He maintained his simple dress and his life from his life as a monk. He doesn't adopt the fancy papal garb. He really does maintain his monastic lifestyle. He is particularly remembered for sending missionaries to Great Britain. Great Britain at this time is not a Christian country, and he sends a guy named Augustine, not of Hippo, but Augustine of Canterbury, to convert the Kents. So at this time, England is separated into 7 different kingdoms. These are Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Danes, I don't know, the Danes won't be coming. So England it's separated into 7 small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. You have, so the kingdoms would be Essex, Wessex, Sussex, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Kent. And they all have their different kings. The big ones are Wessex and Mercia. Those are probably the most powerful ones. But Augustine comes to Canterbury and he talks and he converts the Kentish king to Christianity. And so Kent converts to Christianity, and he sets up he's appointed the first Archbishop of Canterbury, who is of course the head of the English Church even to this day. And Canterbury, this is why Canterbury and not London is the seat of the head of the English Church, because that is where the first Archbishop had his throne, in Canterbury. So that's why that is. If you're ever wondering why the Bishop of London, why it's not it's not called the Archbishop of London, but the Archbishop of Canterbury, that is why. He also sent missionaries to Germany and the Netherlands, and he worked to convert the Christians, who were at that time Arians in those area, Arian Christians, to Orthodox Christianity, because Arianism was, of course, heretical, and so we have to deal with that. Europe at this time, even though Christianity is spreading, is still a very pagan place. There's lots of tribalism. There's lots of old superstitions that really have hold, and Gregory is trying to continue the church's mission to bring those under control. England, by the way, I think we should maybe talk about Vikings a bit, maybe later on. But Vikings, the Norse, I think we'll talk about Vikings a little bit in later chapters. That's going to be interesting for you, because we tend to think of them as raiders, but they really did have a pretty big impact on the development of Europe. So we will talk about Vikings later on. Okay, Norsemen, Norman. I'll give you. Have you ever heard of the Normans? Where do you think they came from? So that's your teaser there. What about our queen? Is our queen descended from Vikings? Could be. We'll see. As I've stated previously, in Italy in the 500s, Italy in the 500s was an unstable place. So the crumbling of the old imperial administration, which had started to fall apart after 476 and after constant invasions by Goths and Lombards, following the reconquest of Italy under Justinian, and the ongoing battles between the Byzantine Empire and various Gothic tribes throughout the century, it created a very chaotic situation. I felt chaotic even saying that sentence. Imperial tax collection had fallen off, and various imperial welfare programs essentially shut down. So these are programs designed to provide bread to the poor, that sort of thing. Gregory had the church fill in this gap by creating new welfare and infrastructure maintenance systems, and by collecting previously imperial taxes. So the church steps in where the imperial government left off, and they reinstitute welfare programs to take care of the poor and ensure that people have some sort of protection from invaders and bandits and all sorts of other nasty people. Gregory saw the collapse of the civilian administration and the political instability of the era as a judgment from God on a wicked world. Gregory and the church began to steadily acquire more territory around Rome in central and in southern Italy, and he governed this land as a secular ruler would govern a kingdom. So the church's land, which is called the Patrimony of St. Peter, so the Patrimony of St. Peter is land owned by the church, and this still exists, by the way. There's still land owned by the church in the Patrimony of St. Peter. That grows under Gregory, and so that it kind of starts to enhance his position, not just as a spiritual leader, but also as a secular ruler. He was instrumental in negotiating twice with two different leaders of the Lombards, which are a group of people from northern Italy who came down to sack Rome a few times. And he essentially gets them to leave. And his diplomatic and his political skills obviously coming in very handy there. As a secular leader, feeding and defending his people, Gregory is quite successful at. And he also provides them with spiritual guidance, and which makes him and all subsequent popes people of great importance. So adding the secular power to his spiritual power really elevated his office. Before him, the Pope was mainly a spiritual office, which exercised some governmental oversight when it was needed. But Gregory, but after Gregory, the Pope was a major player in European political life. So the Pope, before Gregory, would step in when imperial administration failed. But after Gregory, the Pope rules lands of his own. And that brings significant authority to him. Gregory is a very hard worker. He's very conscientious. He is consistently in poor health and in a lot of pain. And he often governs from his bed. He was a prodigious writer. He kept up a massive amount of correspondence with political leaders and his own bishops. And he could be a micromanager at times when he felt it was needed. And he was also very prickly when it came to the issue of pride. In 588, Constantinople, the bishops in Constantinople, in a synod, had granted the title of ecumenical bishop to the Patriarch of Constantinople. Now, ecumenical means universal, so they had given him the title of universal bishop. Gregory bristled at this. He said that this was incredibly prideful. He said it was foolish, proud, profane, wicked, pestiferous, that is harboring infection or disease, blasphemous, and diabolical. And he also compared the patriarch or any bishop who used a title like this to Satan. He said they were like Lucifer. And he threatened to break off the Western Church's relationship with the East over it. And he said it was unthinkable that any bishop should see himself as superior to any other bishop. Gregory, despite enhancing the prestige and power of his office, nonetheless still sees himself as a bishop, as bishop is equal to any other bishop. It's not working for me. And this is where his pride kind of comes in. It's that he doesn't really see the problem here. He said that the title was essentially far too grand and far too high for the important and humble office of a bishop. And he tried without success to get the title revoked. In retaliation, he picked out a title for himself to emphasize his humility in comparison to the pride of the Patriarch of Constantinople. And this makes the title that he chose for himself a bit of an irony. And the title that he chose was the not at all prideful sounding Servus Servorum Dei, servant of the servants of God. Now, that is not the least bit grand or prideful. So, yeah, I think a lot of people might, like, we look at that and we say, "Oh, come on, Gregory, that's even worse." You know, at least the pride that of the Patriarch of Constantinople is out on full display and everybody can see it. He's not hiding anything. But this is really kind of a backhanded attempt to get a really grand title for himself. So that's quite something. Servus Servorum Dei, servant of the servants of God. Right. So Gregory obviously has an issue with pride, and in Gregory's defense, he's keenly aware that he struggles with pride. He's keenly aware of his spiritual and his moral failings, as all good monks are. And if we could smash cut to Martin Luther here, we would. Luther himself was also keenly aware of his own spiritual failings and his sin. So Gregory knows that he has a problem with pride, and he saw it as the root of all vice and a disease that corrupts the whole body. He knows his pride is a problem. And his steadfast determination to practice a monastic lifestyle, even in the grandeur of the papal office, leads us to believe that he actively tried to conquer this sin in his own life. Now, I don't think he was ever quite successful, but he was aware of it, and he tried working on it. As much as pride and humility conflict in Gregory, he never turned up the opportunity to expand the power and the influence of his office. And Gregory is often seen as, if not the genesis of the medieval papacy, at least its impetus. So if the medieval papacy didn't start under Gregory, he at least pushed it into the new century or into the new age. He's the one who got things going. So as an energetic and relatively young man when assuming the office, he was better placed than most to be the energy that gave the office its push into the Middle Ages. Gregory does not really introduce any new theological ideas or scholarship to the church. He is not a theologian on the level of Augustine of Hippo, Jerome, or Ambrose, but he's a very persuasive teacher, and he is zealously dedicated to spreading the Christian faith as it existed at that time. He really formalizes it and entrenches it. Gregory initiates the deviation from Augustinian theology, which much more characterizes the medieval church as time goes on. So this deviation will become more entrenched in the church, and Augustine, his theology, while the church will claim that they are Augustinian and that they hold him in high regard, they will deviate more and more from the theology that he sets up. So he believed, like Augustine and like all of us, that Adam's fall had an impact on humanity and brought sin into the world. But he believed that the fall only weakened man's will and ability to be righteous, but it did not destroy it. So it did not destroy the ability to cooperate, essentially. While Augustine had taught that man's will and ability to do anything righteous on his own, or indeed to participate in his own salvation, had been destroyed by the fall, Gregory taught that man could cooperate in his own salvation. So Augustine had thought that regeneration was necessary before you could fully embrace God. And in fact, you need to be regenerated or brought back to life spiritually before you could embrace and, in fact, come to God. And so man was essentially dead in sin, and dead meaning dead, helpless, without ability, dead. And that in order to believe in God, you need to be regenerated first. Gregory was more in the camp of saying that a man was severely injured by the fall, but could indeed aid his own rescue. So he can't get up, but once the rescuers come and put him on their shoulders, he can kind of hobble along with them, that sort of thing. Man still had free will and could do good deeds and cooperate with grace through good works to gain salvation. So this is where works comes into it. You are saved by grace through faith, but your works can add righteousness to that, and they cooperate with that. So you need works, good works, and you need grace to be saved. It can't just be grace. So you're seeing the deviation here. Gregory held that in baptism, God grants to everyone forgiving grace without any reference to merit whatsoever. So when you are baptized, all the sins committed before you're baptized, those get forgiven when you are baptized. However, after baptism, any sins that you commit after baptism have to be atoned for through the process of penance. And penance is a form of punishment inflicted by man instead of God. So he says either man himself by penance punishes sin in himself, or God taking vengeance on him smites it. So either God will take vengeance on you and smite you, or you punish yourself for your sin. So penance involved not just repenting, but also doing good work and going to confessing your sins. Meritorious works would involve things like giving to the poor, taking up a more ascetic lifestyle, hair shirts, denial of luxuries, etc., and praying a lot, and basically anything that was sacrificial in nature was considered meritorious. Taking, pilgrimages, that sort of thing. We cannot know outright if we do enough penance to pay for our sin, but we can rely on the treasury of merit, on the intercession of the saints to help us. So he did not start the process of calling on saints for intercession, but he encouraged its use and cemented its place in the church. So in the cult of the saints, Gregory wrote, behold, Gregory kind of defines the cult of the saints for us. He says, behold, the severe judge Jesus is about to come. The terror of that mighty council of angels and archangels is at hand. I don't know where he's getting that. In that assembly, our case will be tried, and yet we are not seeking patrons, and yet we are not seeking patrons who will then come to our defense. Our holy martyrs are ready to be your advocates. They desire to be asked. Indeed, if I may say so, they entreat that they may be entreated. So they ask you to help them, that they entreat that they might be entreated. They're asking you to ask them. That's kind of what that means. Seek them as helper of your prayer. Turn to them that they may protect you in your guilt. So there you go, the intercession of the saints set out by the Pope. Gregory encouraged the use and the collection and veneration of holy relics. These can be literally anything that can be claimed to have been owned, touched, or otherwise connected to a saint. Many people of the day believe that these items contain the powers to heal you or to defend you against evil. A lot of this comes from superstition. There's nothing biblical about this. But the combination of local superstitions with the faith is kind of a hallmark of the Catholic Church, and kind of even though the Church officially doesn't recognize such things, it's common in many areas in Europe and South America and all over the world to combine local superstitions and faiths with the Church in some way. It seems that less than halfway through the Church's history that people really forgot about Christ and began making Christianity all about them. And this is the common vice in Christianity, is our tendency to make the faith about us and to try and relate it to us in a way that we understand. So it's not about Christ, it's about us. That's what it becomes about. And elevating us in importance and kind of pushing Christ to the background. I mean, if Christ is not the atonement for all sin, if he is not the intercessor for all of us, and the only intercessor, by the way, then he is simply the mad, angry king waiting to strike us with that lightning bolt and not ready to forgive us. He is not the kind Savior ready to offer forgiveness to those who are contrite in heart and ask for forgiveness. It becomes up to humans, saints, to do that work for us. And I think that we see here, you can see, even if you have a very cursory knowledge of the Middle Ages, you can see here the Middle Ages and their theology developing. The cult of the saints is not just silly, it's dangerous theologically. And as Protestants, we look at this and we say, well, that's absolutely silly, it's dumb. But I think that we are susceptible to the same sort of thing where we put man above Christ. We always seek to elevate ourselves above Christ in some way. I think that's common in the modern church. And we see this all the time when people claim that they can do miracles, when they claim they're healers and they have prophecies and all these sorts of things. And we see this very much in the charismatic movement with the faith healing and all this kind of stuff, with these celebrity pastors elevating themselves to these grand positions, guys like Kenneth Copeland, etc. It's all about elevating self. It's not about elevating Christ. Christ is not in that. They elevate themselves. I did this. We have to be very careful about this. Our faith is about Christ. It's all about Jesus. That was the gift that the Reformation taught us again, is that we deviated so far from the truth. And you may be asking yourself, well, if the church has gone off the rails to this extent, where is the truth? Well, there's always going to be people, and there will always be people who maintain the true faith and who are willing to look back and say there's something wrong here. And we're going to look at that when it comes to the proto-reformers. But the faith will be maintained. Remember, God saved for himself small numbers of true believers in the past, in the Old Testament in particular. And I think he does that throughout history. Whenever the church deviates, he still saves for himself a group of people who have not deviated, who are keeping the faith. So let us not despair, but let us understand that this is the state of the church at the time, and this is where the medieval church comes from. And this, of course, sets the stage for the Reformation. Communion. Gregory taught transubstantiation. So this is the teaching that the bread and the wine are physically transformed into the body and blood of Christ when the consecration is spoken. So the words of the priest during consecration turn the bread and the blood physically into the body and blood of Christ. Communion is offered as a sacrifice for participants only and not for the whole world. So again, seeing communion as sacrifice, it's like sacrificing Christ all over again for the sins of the people who are congregated and taking communion. So their sins are being reatoned for constantly. And if this doesn't bring theological issues into your head, then that's a problem. Was Christ's death really one, what did he really die once for all time, or does he have to be re-sacrificed? Participating in communion could help reduce the amount of penance you would have to do, and it reduced your amount of time in purgatory. So if you died with unatoned for sin, but you were a believer, you could pay for it in purgatory, where you would be in fire and your sins would be burned away forever, however long you were there, until you were brought back into heaven. So there's a story where the Pope Gregory was offering communion and he heard laughing. So he investigated the source of the laughter and found that it was a group of women who had helped make the communion bread. When he asked what they were laughing at, they said that they could not believe that the bread and wine turned into the physical flesh and blood of Christ when they are consecrated. And the Pope refused to give these women communion and prayed to God that he would open their eyes. And after the prayer, he saw some of the communion bread physically turn into flesh, and he showed it to the women, who then repented. And I have their cue Protestant sniggering. Yeah, okay, fine, sure, yeah, sure it did. And in fact, you can still venerate these breads turned to flesh in Germany. These hosts are held at Ondex Abbey in Germany, and I imagine that they are no longer edible, being more than 1,500 years old. And of course, he also held that Mass could be said for the sake of the dead, and that was constant in the Middle Ages. So, yeah, lots of things there. So, other actions. Pope Gregory reformed and formalized the Western Church calendar, and he regulated the number of feast days. And this is not, however, the Gregorian calendar that we use today. The Gregorian calendar that we use on a secular level was instituted by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582. This is the church calendar. So he standardized the Roman Mass, and he made the Mass service standardized across the church. And he solidified the practices of the Roman Church that would guide it through the Middle Ages. He established the papacy as a secular as well as a spiritual authority. He reformed the Mass. He emphasized and re-entrenched the Church's teachings on communion and baptism. He promoted the cult of the saints and the use of relics. And he elevated his office to one of supremacy, though he wouldn't necessarily see it that way, as we previously discussed. And he also sent missionaries into other parts of Europe and Britain. So he is quite a substantial figure in terms of the Middle Ages. This is the guy who sets the papacy in the Middle Ages on its way to the high office occupied by Innocent III, the office that contends with emperors and sees himself as an equal or superior to emperors. Gregory would not have seen himself as superior to the emperor in any way, but eventually his successors will. So that's Pope Gregory. If you have any questions, email me. I'd be happy to answer them. Next week, I'm not sure what we'll look at next week. What's on the agenda there? My paper is missing, or I had that written down. Oh, well. So next week, we will probably be examining the Holy Roman Empire a little bit. We'll look at Charlemagne and the Franks, I think, and I'll show you, or I'll attempt to decipher the papal emperor, or the imperial papal battle that goes up. Maybe we'll look at the investiture controversy a bit. So anyway, I hope you all guys have a great evening. If you have any questions, like I said, please do email me, and we will see you next week.